She walked into the mountains with nothing but a bleeding wound and a name she'd buried. Behind her, ash. Ahead, the stone circle of Velmora. She didn't know the springs were sacred. She sank into the water, closed her eyes. Then he breathed. He was already there, in the dark, in the pool beside her. Large, very large. Eyes that caught moonlight and held it. The blood moon is 5 days away. You're on sacred ground, he said and pressed his hand to her wound. Skin to skin. She didn't pull back. Something between them clicked shut like a lock. She stayed. He never asked her name, but he felt every breath she took. By morning, she was fighting in his training ring. By night, the attack came. And when the dust settled, a captured enemy looked right at her. Someone knew she'd be there. He kept her where he could see her, not as a prisoner, as something he couldn't explain. The blood moon was only 4 days away. Part 2. Watch Part 1. Link in description. Chapter 5. 4 days. Morning came cold and clear, and the camp was already different. Not louder, sharper. More warriors had arrived before dawn, she gathered. The camp had expanded. The outer perimeter had doubled, and the preparations she'd noticed at the edges of the firelight the night before, the symbols, the swept circle, the dark fabric strung between the trees, had multiplied overnight into something that now had visible weight. She moved through it and felt the change in how it received her. Yesterday she'd been an unknown, something to catalog and monitor. This morning she was a variable in a situation that had grown more complex, and the camp's awareness of her had sharpened accordingly. Eyes that tracked her movement and didn't look away when she caught them. A subtle adjustment of space, not threatening, but deliberate. The way a group of experienced men communicated, without words, that they had updated their assessment of a thing. She was no longer just an outsider. She was an outsider who had been present during an attack, who had fought in their camp without invitation, who their king had neither removed nor explained. Regnar was already visible near the command tent, speaking to Veld, 2 new faces beside him she hadn't seen before. His bearing was the same as it always was, straight, settled. He didn't look up as she crossed the camp. She registered this and kept moving. The training ground was a cleared space at the southern end of camp, flat-packed earth with a ring of supply crates serving as rough boundary markers. When she arrived, 6 warriors were already working through drills in pairs, controlled, efficient, the kind of repetition that lived in muscle rather than mind. She stood at the edge and watched. Their style was northern, different from what she'd trained in, heavier in the center, more reliance on force over angle. Effective for what they were, but she could see the gaps. The moments where someone trained differently would find space that a mirror-trained opponent would miss. She was aware, in the back of her mind, that Merritt had told her not to fight for 24 hours. She stepped into the ring anyway. The nearest warrior, young, broad, the kind of build that made people underestimate footwork, stopped and looked at her, then at her blades. Then, with the particular recalibration of someone revising their expectation, he moved into her space. Not hostile, a test. She let him set the distance and then halved it, and for the next 20 seconds they moved through an exchange that wasn't quite sparring and wasn't quite anything else. Controlled contact, pressure and response, both of them reading the other. She found the gap in his left side on the 3rd exchange. Didn't exploit it, just touched the edge of it with the flat of her blade and stepped back. He looked at her with something that had shifted from assessment to attention. She nodded and turned away. She found a space and began to work. Nara didn't push, just her own drills, slow at first, feeling the wound's response to movement. It ached. She managed it, adjusted her left side mechanics without losing the line of each motion, compensating with precision what she couldn't compensate with force. The warriors around her had stopped, watching each other. She was faster than they'd expected. That was always how it went. The initial stillness of observers, then the quiet adjustment as they recalibrated, then the particular attention of fighters watching someone else's technique with professional interest. She moved through the sequence. Faster. Left blade low, right blade clearing, the footwork she'd drilled 10,000 times in southern camps with dust in her lungs and her father's voice counting rhythm at the edge of the training ground. She moved too fast. The shift came without warning, a sharper step than she'd planned, her left foot landing at an angle, and the wound clenched like a fist beneath her bandaging. Her balance redistributed wrong. For half a second, just half, she was not entirely in control of where she was going. She heard movement before she registered what it meant. One step, fast, from her right. She recovered, caught her balance, came back to center with a controlled exhale, blades settling back to ready, left side burning. He had stopped. One step out from where he'd been standing. She hadn't seen him arrive, hadn't known he was watching. His right arm was slightly extended, not reached out, not offering. The instinctive forward movement of someone whose body had made a decision before their mind caught up, arrested mid-motion. 3 feet between them. His eyes were on her. Underneath the flat attention she'd learned to read, something was closer to the surface than it had been the night before. Something that had no interest in being named. She straightened fully. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the training ground had stilled. She was aware of it distantly, the held breath, the absence of movement. But what was real was the space between them and the fact that neither of them had altered it. His arm returned to his side with the specific deliberateness of someone putting something away by force. She took one step back. Not retreat, a choice. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the command tent without a word. The training ground resumed around her. She breathed through the burn in her side and made sure her hands were steady before she moved again. He stopped at the tree line, hand braced against a pine trunk. She moved like water and struck like iron, and she'd been 3 feet from him, and her hair had been loose and he'd smelled blood, fresh, the wound reopened, and he'd moved before he'd done anything as human as deciding. That was the problem, stated simply. She'd lost her balance and he'd moved, and between those two events there had been nothing. No assessment, no calculation, no considered response. Just the animal fact of it. He stayed at the tree line for 90 seconds, long enough to put the wolf back where it belonged. He resumed his walk towards the command tent. He tracked her from 30 feet through a crowd of 40 warriors and a camp in active preparation, without once looking directly at her. He knew, with the particular humiliating precision of an instinct that didn't care about his opinion, that she was near the supply line, that she was standing still, that her breathing had leveled out from the training ground but was still slightly elevated, the wound pulling at her with each full inhale. The blood moon was 4 days away. His instincts had been climbing all week. This was not new. The wolf was always closer to the surface during the blood week, always pressing harder against the discipline that kept it governed rather than suppressed. He had simply never had a variable like her here before. He pushed it down and went back to Veld. Byrne was one of the new arrivals, broad, capable, currently standing near the weapons line with something building behind his expression. "She trained in the ring," he said. Not to her, to Veld, who was nearby. "We don't know who she is. We don't know how she got here." Nara was looking at the weapon rack, not at Byrne. Not away from him in the way of someone avoiding, simply not granting the exchange the status of her attention. "We don't know what she is," Byrne added. "Human," said one of the other warriors mildly. "Reasonably certain." In a Velmoran sacred site, during the blood week, after an attack. "She fought in the attack," Veld said. "I noticed." Byrne's tone said that was exactly part of the problem. Nara set down the blade she'd been examining and picked up another. "She stays." Regnar's voice, from further away than should have carried. Same register, same weight, same absolute economy of explanation. Byrne said nothing else. Nara set the blade back and walked away from the weapons line. She found a space near the eastern water containers. Flat stone, good light, enough separation from the camp's center activity to think clearly. She started adjusting the bandaging at her side. The training had opened it when she heard his footfall. She knew it before she processed the sound, the specific weight and evenness of it. She'd apparently memorized it without intending to. She kept her hands at her side and didn't look up. He crouched in front of her, his attention entirely on the wound. Reached, slowly this time, nothing instinctive, just deliberate. One hand moving toward the edge of the bandaging. She watched his hand. His fingers touched the fabric. She felt the warmth of it through the linen. Her breathing changed, not audibly, just structurally, a slight deepening she couldn't prevent. He pressed lightly, checking the tension of the wrap. She didn't pull away. His face was close. The quality of his concentration, complete, directed, sat alongside something else that lived in the same space and was not clinical at all. She'd felt it at the springs, at the perimeter, in every shared space since, and it was closer now than it had been in any of them. His hand stilled. The pause was too long for what it was. For a second longer than it should have been, neither of them moved. Then she stepped back, clean, 2 feet. She put the distance between them and held his gaze with her face arranged into the same composure she'd been wearing since she arrived. His hand lowered. He stood. "Merit," he said, "this evening." "I'll manage it." "I know." A beat. "Manage it with merit." He walked away. She looked at the stone and took one careful breath and did not examine what her pulse was doing. The prisoner talked at midday. Not much. One word carried through the camp on a short exchange between Lucan and Regnar that she caught the edge of from 20 feet away. Dravon. She didn't know the name, but she watched Regnar's face receive it, the single, precise tightening around his eyes that wasn't surprise. Confirmation. The weight of a thing he'd suspected, becoming a thing he had to act on. Lucan said something else, short. Regnar nodded once and said 4 words she couldn't hear. Lucan glanced at her once, noting that she'd been close enough to hear. She held his gaze and said nothing. Dravon. A rival king. A name that mattered. She filed it and let it sit. She thought about what Lucan had said at the fire the night before. Someone knew where he'd be. She thought about the prisoner's eyes, that flicker toward her during the interrogation. What it meant that someone had expected her to be here. She had no answers. She had questions, and the discipline to sit with them, and the patience not to reach for conclusions before she had ground to stand them on. By mid-afternoon, the ceremony preparation was impossible to ignore. The swept circle now held dark stones at measured intervals, the ground between them marked with spiral symbols in something still wet enough to catch the light. Warriors she'd seen running drills that morning were moving through the space with a different quality of attention, slower, more deliberate, each gesture carrying intention. She watched it and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with instinct, that this wasn't symbolic. It wasn't ceremony for its own sake. The preparation wasn't ornamental. It was structural. It was building something, or perhaps opening something, aligning the space with a force she didn't have language for, but could feel at the edges of the clearing, the way you felt weather before it arrived. She stood at the boundary of the swept circle and did not cross it. One warrior noticed. He met her eyes, looked at the line, looked back at her. Something passed between them, not warning, something closer to recognition, before he turned away. She walked away. Evening settled blue and cold over the mountain. He had been standing in the circle long enough to know this wasn't preparation. It wasn't ritual. It wasn't the deliberate stillness a king sought before the blood moon. It was her. That was the problem. He looked at it the way he looked at any weakness, directly, without excuse. His instincts had been rising since the beginning of the blood week, the wolf closer to the surface than he allowed at any other time of year. And into that state she had walked, wounded, controlled, carrying herself with a precision that had pulled his attention in a way he had not fully corrected since. She was a distraction, but that wasn't the worst of it. She was instability. 4 days before a ceremony that demanded absolute control, with a rival already moving, with every decision he made being watched, measured. She was a variable he could not afford. And it was his mistake that she was still here. He cut the thought there. The reason didn't matter. The decision did. She needed to leave. Tonight, or at first light. He would give her food, a direction, a clean exit. No conflict, no questions. Finished. It should have been an easy decision. It should have been. He was still holding it when he felt her. Not sound, not movement. Presence. A shift in the air behind him. Subtle, but enough. Her scent followed a second later. Blood, cold, and something beneath both that he refused to name. He didn't turn. She stepped into the circle. He tracked her without looking, left toward the smaller stones. A pause, then the quiet shift of her settling. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He let the silence settle. Then he made the decision. "What are you running from?" His voice stayed level, his gaze fixed on the valley. Behind him, he felt her stillness adjust. Not surprise, recognition. She had expected something else. She didn't answer immediately. He gave her the space. "Are they still following you?" "No." Quiet. Certain. That was enough. If she were being hunted, she was a risk. She wasn't. He moved on. "Do you need anything?" The pause this time was different. Longer. He heard it, not in words, but in the shift of her breath, the moment she understood what he was offering. Not help, an exit. "I'll manage." The same words, but not the same weight. She was deciding. He kept his gaze forward and waited, the pull of the blood moon already working through his system, the tension between them held in place like something drawn tight between two fixed points. "Leave," he thought, steady, not unkind. "Take what I'm offering and go." The silence stretched. Then, "I'll take some food." Something in his chest reacted before he shut it down. Sharp. Unwanted. She was leaving. That was correct. That was the decision. He had given her a way out, and she had taken it. He nodded once. "Veld will have it ready." He heard her rise. The controlled movement of someone managing pain without showing it. The shift of her blades settling. Then footsteps. Moving away. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the valley until the sound of her faded into the camp, until the air inside the circle settled back into something that held only him. He stood in the silence. Everything was in place. The blood moon was coming. His people were ready. The plan was intact. She was leaving. It was the right decision. He looked toward the place where she had been sitting, and even through distance, through the camp, the movement, the noise, he could still find her. Not by sight, by direction. She was moving toward the supply line, toward Veld. The distance between them lengthening with every step. It should have felt like relief. He stood beneath the darkening sky, the pull of the blood moon already tightening in his blood. and felt that distance stretch between them. Not empty, held, like a line drawn taut, like something with two ends. Chapter 6. Dravon. She left an hour after full dark. No announcement, no calculation. She took the food she'd been allocated from the common stores, dried meat, a small block of hard cheese, a skin of water, wrapped it in her outer layer, and walked out of the camp's southern edge while the watch rotation was changing and the window of easy movement was exactly 30 seconds wide. She didn't look back toward the stone circle. She'd been in that camp for a day, and already she could feel the shape of things closing around her. The ceremony, the attack, the name Dravon, the way Regnar's stillness had angled toward her without him moving, the way her own pulse had behaved in the space between them. All of it accumulating into something with weight and direction. And she had spent 12 years learning to recognize that particular feeling before it became a situation she couldn't walk out of. So she walked out of it. The mountain received her without ceremony, cold air and dark pine, and the particular silence of high altitude at night. She moved fast, faster than was entirely wise with the wound pulling at her left side, but speed was what the first hour required. Distance. The clean logic of putting ground between herself and whatever was happening in that camp. Distance from the camp. From him. She told herself it was practical. She told herself very little else. The path she chose angled southwest along the ridge, not the eastern pass she'd come through, which was too obvious and probably watched, but a narrow traverse she'd clocked from the camp's high ground during the afternoon. It would take her around the worst of the northern territory and give her a route that curved eventually back toward the south. Longer, less direct. She moved through it without a torch, letting her eyes adjust and then adjust again, reading the terrain by moonlight and the pale suggestion of snow on the upper rock faces. The wound was talking to her within the first mile, not screaming, a steady, insistent pull that told her the bandaging had shifted and the training ground hadn't done her any favors. She breathed through it the way she'd breathed through worse, and kept her left arm slightly raised, reducing the stretch across her ribs. The night passed in motion, rock and root and the occasional scramble across loose shale where the path dissolved into suggestion. Her breath coming in controlled rhythms, vapor rising and gone. The ache in her side building from insistent to something more demanding, and her managing it mile by mile with the practiced economy of someone who'd learned that pain was information rather than instruction. She didn't think about the camp. She didn't think about the stone circle or the way the air had felt inside it. She didn't think about him. That part required a little more effort than the rest. She thought about footing and gradient and the position of the moon and how long before first light. That was sufficient. She reached the stream near dawn, following the sound of it down a short drop in the terrain. It ran fast and cold between flat stones, fed from snowmelt above, clear enough to see the bottom. The light was coming. Gray first, then pale gold catching the upper ridgeline while the valley below stayed dark. She could see further now, the slope she'd come down, the tree line ahead, the terrain opening slightly into a wider traverse. She crouched at the edge, drank with her hands. For a second, a shadow passed over the water. Her body reacted before the thought formed, turning, blade already half drawn. Nothing. Just a cloud crossing the sun. She held still a moment longer than necessary. For an instant, the shadow had taken a shape she shouldn't have been looking for. Her stomach tightened anyway. She ate half of what she'd taken from the camp stores, drank again, and stood. Her side had stiffened during the 2 minutes of rest. She pressed her hand against it briefly, feeling the bandaging, damp at the edge. Not soaked. Manageable. She kept moving. Every few minutes, her attention flicked behind her without reason. No sound, no movement, just the persistent sense that if anyone could follow her here, it would be him. They came from 3 directions, which was professional. She caught the first one by sound, a footfall slightly too deliberate in the brush to her left, and was already turning when the second came in fast from ahead, blade drawn, no preamble. She dropped under his reach and came up inside his guard with her short blade, took him out of the fight in one exchange that cost her nothing but the sudden, violent protest of her wound as she torqued sharply left. The third and fourth came together. She gave ground, not retreat, just management, and worked the terrain, putting a boulder at her back and forcing them into a single approach angle. They were good, trained, coordinated, trying to split her attention and tire her arm. One of them opened a cut along her right forearm that she didn't fully avoid. She ended it fast because she didn't have the reserves for a long fight. When it was over, she was breathing hard against the boulder, one hand pressed to her side where the bandaging had completely given way, blood warm and immediate against her palm. The cut on her forearm was deep and stinging. 4 fighters down, 3 of them dead. The fourth didn't die. He hit the ground unconscious, breath still there, uneven but steady enough to matter. She stood there for 10 seconds, just breathing. For a moment, she expected to feel it again, that sharp, immediate awareness of him at her back. There was nothing. The absence was louder than it should have been. Then she looked at the nearest body properly. She knew his face. Not well. She'd had 3 seconds of close proximity the night before, in firelight, during a fight. But she'd catalogued him the way she catalogued everything, and the memory was there when she needed it. He'd been one of Dravon's men. She crouched, ignoring the pull at her side, and checked the others. The insignia she found on the second confirmed it. A small thing, pressed metal, the kind you wore on the inside of a collar where it didn't show. The same mark she'd seen on the captured attacker during last night's interrogation. She sat back on her heels. This was not a random mountain ambush. They had been placed on this path deliberately, which meant someone had anticipated movement from the camp, or was watching it closely enough to react. Not her. They weren't here for her. They couldn't have been, which meant something else entirely. Dravon's camp was close enough to see, close enough to move, close enough to strike again. And it was watching. She forced her breathing down. One inhale, another. She tore a strip from the hem of her tunic and bound it around the deep cut on her arm. Bracing one end with her teeth, she pulled hard with her right hand, tightening it until the fabric bit into the wound and the bleeding slowed. Then she moved. South first. Not far, just enough. She pushed through the brush with deliberate noise, letting her steps carry, letting the path be clear for anyone who might follow. Toward the mountain, toward the obvious route. Then she cut away. Silent now. Back through the trees, angling toward the direction the last one would take when he woke and tried to return. She gave him time. Then she went after him. She followed at distance, through a section of dense pine that offered good cover, until the trees thinned against a cliff face and the camp opened below her in a natural bowl in the rock. She went flat on the ridge and counted. 60 warriors at minimum, possibly more in the outer tents. The camp was organized with the efficiency of a force that had been here long enough to settle, but not long enough to grow complacent. Clean lines, central fire, a structured perimeter that told her they expected either observation or contact. Equipment in order, weapons staged, no wasted movement. These were not scouts or a raiding party. This was a mobilized force waiting for a signal. She was already cataloging exits when she saw the tent. Separate from the others, positioned near the cliff face, close enough to the rock that it had only one approach, which meant it was either where Dravon slept or where he kept something he didn't want accessible. 2 guards at the entrance, different quality of attention than the rest of the camp, not watching outward, watching the tent itself. She shifted slightly for a better angle. A stone slipped under her palm, just enough to make her freeze. No one below reacted. She stayed still anyway. The tent flap opened. A woman came out, not freely. She moved with the constrained carriage of someone allowed limited space, and the guard at her left adjusted his position as she moved, maintaining proximity without contact. She was northern in her appearance, the height and bone structure of it. Dark hair, young, but not as young as she looked. There was a quality in her face that recognized where it was and what that meant. Then the child. He came out behind her. A boy, small, perhaps 5, perhaps 6. He stayed close to the woman's side with the instinctive proximity of a child who understood on some animal level that she was the safest thing in the immediate vicinity. One of the guards put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, directing him back toward the tent, and the woman's entire body registered it. A sharp, controlled stillness, the suppression of a response she couldn't afford to make visible. Nara lay on the ridge and looked at the child for a long moment. She didn't know who they were. She had fragments, the camp, Dravon's name, the significance of the blood week, the stone circle that belonged to Velmora's king. She didn't need the specific identities. The situation had a shape, and the shape was clear. Someone had been taken to ensure something. She tracked back from the camp below to the sequence of events: the attack at the sacred site, the fragment of a name, the fighters on the mountain path, herself followed specifically, all of it radiating outward from one center. She withdrew from the ridge carefully, staying flat until she had enough cover to move, and then she sat with her back against a pine and her hand against her side and let herself have 30 seconds to think. South was still there. The route was damaged, she'd have to find another, but it existed, and she was still mobile, and whatever was happening in that valley below was not her war, and not her king, and not her problem. She pressed her eyes briefly closed, saw the child's face, the way he'd stayed close to the woman, the way the woman had gone still when the guard touched him. She opened her eyes. The mountains stretched south and cold and patient. She picked up her blades, checked the edge of both without looking at them, and stood. Then she turned north, back toward the stone circle, back toward the camp, back toward the thing she'd walked out of just 10 hours ago with the specific intention of not going back. She moved fast because the wound was going to make her slow down eventually, and she wanted distance behind her before it did. The terrain was familiar now. She'd come this way. She knew the footing. She used that knowledge and kept her breathing even and did not examine the decision she'd made. She'd looked at the child. That was sufficient. Chapter 7. Return. She came back through the northern tree line deep into the night, moving on something that had stopped being strength hours ago and become will alone. The forest thinned as she descended, less cover, more exposure, the trees pulling apart to reveal cold sky and hard ground. She adjusted automatically, dropping her center, keeping to shadow where any remained. Her left side had been talking to her for the last hour in a language that was getting harder to argue with. She argued with it anyway. She was already inside the outer perimeter when she felt them. 2 guards. Right side. Close. Too close. She stopped. Hands visible. Breath controlled. And then something else. Not sound. Not movement. Presence. It reached her a fraction before she saw him. Regnar stepped out of the dark between the trees. Not from the direction of the camp. from the forest itself, as if he'd been standing there long enough that the night had already accepted him. The guards didn't move. They didn't need to. His gaze found her and held. 1 second. That was all it took. He crossed the distance fast, and his hand closed around her arm. Not rough, not careful. Certain. The grip of someone who had already assessed the situation and made his decision before arriving. You're hit. Northeast Ridge. Her breath caught on the words. She pushed through it. 60, maybe more. Inside. She shook her head once, sharp. Listen to me. His grip tightened just enough. Inside, he said again, quieter, final. This time she didn't fight it. Her body had already made that decision for her. She started talking before they reached the tent, forcing the information out in the right order. Most critical first, details after, the way she'd been trained. 10 hours northeast at pace. Staged camp, not holding. They're ready to move fast. Her breath hitched on a bad step and she pulled it back. 60 warriors minimum, elite, and hostages. 2, a woman and a child. He didn't slow, didn't interrupt, just kept her moving, his hand still on her arm, steady against the unsteadiness she refused to name. The tent flap opened, closed behind them. Sit. She sat, her legs making the decision before she did, folding at the edge of the cot with a relief that hit too fast and too deep. She locked her jaw against it. I'm not done, she said immediately. I know, he said. He was already at the entrance, Moret's name in his voice, and then he was back. Close. The firelight inside the tent was low but direct, and she could see him clearly for the first time since the springs. The set of his jaw, the quality of his attention, the way he was looking at her as if cataloging damage she hadn't told him about yet. Report, he said. She dragged a full breath in and pushed the rest out. The hostages are separate from the main camp. Cliff-backed tent, guarded, but the guards face out, not in. She held his gaze. They're not hidden. They want them found. This is a message, not a secret. His expression didn't change, but something under it did. The woman, he said. Describe her. My age, dark hair. She knew exactly where she was and what it meant. Nara swallowed. She wasn't afraid, she was managing. A pause, shorter and heavier than the ones before it. The child? 5, maybe 6. That was when it landed. Not on his face, not in any obvious way. But she saw it. A shift, small and precise, moving through him like a current beneath still water. The controlled surface held. What moved underneath it was something else entirely. Moret entered without ceremony, took one look, and didn't ask permission. The binding came off. The air hit the wound. Nara's fingers curled into the edge of the cot, just once, just briefly, and Moret made a quiet sound. Not alarm, something worse. Recognition. This should not have held this long, she muttered, already reaching for her kit with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen too many wounds to be surprised and too many soldiers to be sympathetic. Regnar's gaze dropped, brief, sharp. It took in the full damage, the reopened wound, the blood-dark bandaging, the cut along Nara's forearm she'd mostly forgotten about, and came back up. Too controlled. I'm still... Nara started. You're done, Moret said. She's not, Regnar said. Moret didn't look at him. Then she talks while I fix what she broke. He didn't argue, didn't move, stayed exactly where he was, close enough that Nara could feel him there without looking, a warmth and a weight at the edge of her awareness. She felt the needle, let it register and kept going. Moret pressed deeper into the wound. The pain cut through clean and sudden, and Nara's breath broke. Just once, just a half-second fracture in the control she'd been holding for the last 3 hours. His hand came down on her shoulder. Firm, steadying. There before she'd registered him moving. Too fast to be a considered thing, purely instinct, purely immediate. The reaction of someone whose body had made a decision the rest of him was still catching up to. She felt the weight of it, the heat of his hand through her clothing, the solidity of it, the way it simply held without asking whether it was wanted. It didn't move. Not when it should have. Not at the moment she would have expected it to. Mireille glanced up, just once, both brows lifting a fraction. A look that was not subtle, was not missed, and was not commented on. Nara shifted, just enough, a small, deliberate thing. His hand stayed 1 second longer, then released. Clean. Gone. He stepped back. The shift in him was immediate, command settling back into place like armor finding its fit, the king reasserting himself over whatever the last 30 seconds had been. "I'll wake Lucan," he said. "We plan before dawn." He didn't look at her again when he left, but the awareness didn't go with him. She felt that clearly. The space where he'd been still defined by his absence, the shoulder where his hand had rested still carrying the memory of the weight. Mireille worked in silence for a moment. Then, without looking up, "You're going to be a problem." Nara said nothing. She didn't have the energy for that kind of conversation, and Mireille, to her credit, didn't push it. Outside, the camp changed. She could hear it even from inside the tent, the quality of quiet shifting, turning from stillness into direction. Footsteps with purpose, orders given low and carried fast, the particular sound of a camp that has been handed something to do and is doing it. By the time Mireille finished, the pain had organized itself into something manageable, and the world had narrowed into its clearest components. Breath, position, what came next. The tent flap opened. Regnar came back inside, and this time he didn't stop at the entrance. He covered the distance between them and stopped in front of her, and he looked at her the way he had at the stone circle. Fully, without the tactical distance he used everywhere else. "They had 4 men on the mountain path," she said. "Not patrol, placed, waiting." A beat. "Someone watched me leave and moved them into position before I'd cleared the first ridge." His eyes darkened. He had suspected. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. Not accusation, not command. Something else, living in the same charged space that had existed between them at the springs, at the perimeter, in the circle where neither of them had moved first. She held his gaze. "There was a child." The words landed cleanly. No defense, no ornament, just fact. She drew a breath and gave him the rest. "The hostages aren't random. The woman is northern. Ceremonial markings." Her voice slowed slightly, fatigue catching at the edges of it. "The child is young." Something shifted in his expression. "Dravon isn't trying to kill you," she said. "He's forcing a choice." He was quiet for a moment. "The blood moon changes the balance of the Northern Alliance," he said at last. "Any alpha who enters the ceremony weakened, politically or militarily, enters at a disadvantage that lasts until the next one." His tone stayed even, spare. "If I move for the hostages, I expose weakness before the ceremony. If I don't, I abandon 2 people and lose every alliance built on the expectation that I protect what's mine." "He built the trap before you knew she was missing." "Yes." "Who is she?" A short pause. Waited. "My sister-in-law," he said. "My brother's widow. The child is his son." She let that settle. Then he knew this would work. He knew it was the one thing that might. His jaw shifted. "It doesn't change the calculation. It only makes it harder." She looked at him then, at the control on the surface, and the strain beneath it she had been catching only in fragments for the last few days, and could now see more clearly. He carried it the way she carried pain. managed so well that only someone watching closely would know it was there. She had been watching closely. 3 days, he said. The blood moon doesn't wait. No, she said, it doesn't. A beat. We start before dawn, he said. Not a question, an inclusion. Something in her registered the shift and said nothing. Lucan will be here shortly, he said. We planned together. He paused, still looking at her. You mapped the camp. I can draw it. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the exchange required. Something in his expression moved, small, unsanctioned, gone too quickly to name. I know, he said, and this time he didn't leave. He moved to the opposite side of the low table at the center of the tent, braced his hands against it, and looked at her across the narrow space with the quiet expectancy of someone already turning toward the next step. Outside, Lucan's voice carried through the canvas. The blood moon was 3 days away. Dravon's camp was 10 hours northeast and already preparing to move. The night was no longer the problem. What came with dawn was. Chapter 8. Before Dawn. They planned in low voices over a map that did not yet exist. Nara drew it from memory, not roughly, not approximately, but with the precise economy of someone who had read terrain while bleeding through a reopened wound. Lines, elevations, angles of approach, the cliff face, the hostage tent, guard placement, the reach of the fire. She marked distances with her fingers first, then translated them onto the surface in controlled strokes. Regnar watched her hand more than the map. Not for information, he already had that. He watched because the steadiness didn't match what he knew of her condition. There was a delay, slight but real, between intent and motion. A correction in the wrist she didn't acknowledge. She was holding something together by force. Here, Lucan said, leaning in. If we split into 3 units at the pass. No. Regnar's gaze shifted to the map. This is extraction. We don't split unless we're forced to. 60 men don't sit idle, Lucan said. They're expecting movement. They're expecting a response, Regnar said. Force, speed, something they can read. He straightened slightly. We give them nothing they can read. His eyes moved to Nara. She didn't look up, but the tension in her shoulders shifted. Just enough. The guards here, she said, marking the entrance. They rotate, but one stays fixed. He watches the child, not the perimeter. Regnar's jaw tightened. Lucan caught it. Then that's our opening. If we remove him, we don't remove him. Lucan looked at him. We avoid him, Regnar said. 1 missing guard changes the camp before we're clear. Lucan held his gaze, then nodded. Silence settled, not empty, weighted, measured against time. 3 days. Nara's hand slowed. Regnar saw it before she did. The line lost its edge. Barely. Enough. Finish the ridge line, he said, quiet. I am. She wasn't. The line broke. Lucan glanced between them. Then the charcoal slipped from her fingers. Regnar moved before it hit the table. He caught her cleanly, one arm at her shoulders, the other at her side, already adjusting for the wound without needing to look for it. Her weight came into him fully this time, without resistance. For a moment, she was simply there, still, unarmored, real in a way she had not allowed herself to be since she entered his camp. She's out, Lucan said. I know. Lucan exhaled. I'll start positioning the first unit. No. Regnar adjusted his hold. We move at first light. That narrows our window. It removes guesswork. Lucan studied him, then nodded and moved toward the exit. At the flap, he paused. She changed the equation, he said without turning. Regnar didn't answer. Lucan left. The tent settled into quiet. Regnar stood there a moment longer than necessary. He knew it. He didn't move anyway. She was lighter than she should have been. Not weak. Nothing about her was that. But without the constant tension she carried, her body rested differently. Stripped of control. Simpler. He moved to the cot and lowered her carefully. His hands stayed at her shoulders. Unnecessary. He left them there anyway. Then the wolf stirred. Not sharp, not violent. Certain. Her scent reached him fully now. Blood, cold air, pine. And something beneath it that had been there since the springs and had not left him since. It rose, steady, intent. Mine. Not a thought, recognition. He leaned, just slightly. Her hair brushed his face, softer than it should have been in this place. He closed his eyes for one controlled second. Mate. His jaw locked. He reached for the blanket instead, drawing it over her in one careful motion, and his fingers caught briefly on her shoulder as he adjusted it. Contact he couldn't entirely call accidental and didn't examine. He stayed there a moment longer with his eyes on her face. The tension still held in the corners of her mouth even in sleep. The slight furrow between her brows that hadn't left since she'd walked into his camp, as if her body maintained its guard even when her mind had finally released it. He recognized that expression. He'd worn it for years. He straightened, stepped back, turned away from the cot with the specific deliberateness of a man removing himself from a situation he couldn't afford. Outside, the air was colder. It didn't help. He stood at the edge of the camp and breathed through it. Control brought down hard, deliberate, the same discipline that had built everything he stood in now. The wolf pushed. He held. It pressed harder, finding the seam, testing it. Mate. He forced it down, held, until his body remembered the order of things. Then he turned. Lucan. Lucan stepped from the dark. "We proceed as planned," Regnar said. "No deviations, no engagement unless forced." Lucan studied him, longer this time. Understood. A beat. 3 days. 3 days. Regnar's gaze flicked once toward the command tent, then away. Inside, she slept. Outside, the blood moon pulled closer. He turned toward the ridge, toward the problem he could solve, and left the other behind him. Chapter 9. The Ridge. She was already on her feet when he turned, too fast, too upright for a body that had been folding an hour earlier, the firelight catching the deliberate set of her jaw, the stillness of someone who had already decided and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. "You're not going," he said. No introduction, no preface. She didn't hesitate. "Yes, I am." His jaw tightened. "You can barely stand." "I can move." "You ran 10 hours through mountain terrain on an open wound." "And I made it back." A beat. That was not the point. They both knew it. "You slow us down," he said. "I make it cleaner." Her voice was even. "I've seen the terrain. You haven't." "I don't need to see it. I know enough." "You know the map," she said. "I know where the ground gives under your feet." Silence. Short, sharp. He stepped closer. Not threatening, just enough to make the space between them stop pretending to be neutral. "You don't go back there like this." Her breath shifted, not because of the wound. "You're trying to control too many variables at once," she said, "and that's why you're trying to be one more." "I am not. Don't try to control me." A beat, longer this time. Something in the air between them changed texture. "For that," he said quietly, "you'd have to not be one." She exhaled once, steadier. "Why?" he asked. Not sharp, not commanding, real. Her answer came without delay. "My path runs through that ridge anyway." His eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not the reason." "No," she said. "You know the reason." "You think that's enough?" he asked. "For me?" she said. "Yes." A beat, then quieter. "And if I stay, it will be harder to leave later." Not strategy, not logic. He felt it land, felt what it did beneath his ribs. The wolf stirred, immediate, certain, and he shut it down hard before it could name anything. "So you leave," he said. "Yes." She didn't soften it, didn't hesitate, just turned. No waiting for permission, no waiting for him, and the immediacy of it caught him off guard in a way he hadn't prepared for. He'd known she would go. He hadn't thought it would be now, like this, already. Something in him moved before thought caught up. "All right, come." The words were out before he'd finished deciding them. She stopped. "If you come," he continued, more controlled now, "you come with us, and you return with us, and you stay until that wound stops trying to kill you." She turned, studied him with the careful attention she gave everything, reading the space between what he'd said and what he hadn't. "You don't give orders well outside your camp," she said. Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Then take it as a condition." A pause. "Fine." Just that. They moved before full light broke. 8 shadows threading through the tree line in the last of the dark, the mountain absorbing them without acknowledgement. Lucan ahead, 2 warriors flanking wide, the others spaced into the natural gaps of the terrain. Nara moved where she chose, not tucked inside the formation, not exposed at the edges. Free, in the way of someone who understood the logic of a team without needing to be managed by it. Regnar stayed just behind Lucan and didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. He knew her position with the unwanted precision that had been operating since the springs, the slight irregularity of her breathing as the climb steepened, the way she favored her left less as the movement warmed the muscle, the small adjustments of a body that had learned to work around damage rather than wait for it to heal. The climb took hours, steep, cold, wordless. The mountain demanded concentration, and they gave it, moving through the gray pre-dawn until the trees thickened into the ridge approach and the camp opened below them in its natural bowl. Firelight, movement, structure. 60 men, organized and waiting, the camp of a force that had been here long enough to settle, but not long enough to grow complacent. Regnar watched the perimeter rotation for 4 minutes and had what he needed. Lucan marked the gaps beside him without being asked. "Cliff-back tent," Nara said quietly, close at his shoulder. "Same as before. 1 fixed guard, he doesn't rotate. He'll be watching the interior." Regnar looked at the angle of the cliff face, the way shadow collected at its base, the narrow corridor of ground that the camp's perimeter geometry left unwatched. "We split at the supply line," he said. "Lucan takes primary entry as diversion, controlled, visible enough to pull attention. We take the cliffside." "We." Neither of them acknowledged it. Lucan nodded once, moved to position his unit without another word. They went in on his signal. No sound, no clash. 8 people and the spaces between them, moving into the camp's seams, the places where 60 men hadn't bothered to watch because nothing should have been approaching from that angle. Nara led the cliff approach, Regnar 1 step behind, close enough to respond, far enough not to crowd her movement. She navigated the dip in the ground, the shadow corridor, the narrowing of space where rock met canvas, all of it exactly as she'd described, the terrain yielding to someone who'd already learned its logic. The tent's back wall, 2 pegs pulled free, silent, a gap just wide enough. She went in first. The woman was awake. She'd probably been awake for hours, sitting with her back to the cliff face and her child against her side with the specific alertness of someone who had run out of things to do except wait. She saw Nara and went completely still. Then her eyes moved past her to Regnar, and something in her face broke open, briefly, fully, before she shut it down and replaced it with something harder and more functional. She nodded, sharp, ready. The boy was asleep. She woke him with practiced quiet, her hand over his mouth before his eyes opened, his body already trained to the gesture. He came awake without sound, looked at his mother's face, and understood from it what was required. He was perhaps 6 years old and already knew how to be silent in a dangerous place. They moved toward the gap. 3 steps from the wall, his foot found the small depression where the peg had pulled free. The ground soft and uneven, his weight committing wrong before any of them could adjust for it. The loose rope end caught his ankle. He pitched forward with the sudden, total commitment of a child's fall. Nara's hand was already moving, no thought. Her fingers closed into the back of his collar as his full weight tipped past the point of return, and for one suspended second, both of them went with it, her lead foot losing the ground and her side tearing open with a pain that went past sharp into something structural and white. She pulled, everything left, concentrated into her grip, her arm, the absolute refusal to open her hand. The boy came back over the edge, stumbling against her, his face pressing instinctively into her shoulder. She held him. Then the shout came, outside, cut short, but not short enough, and Lucan's voice somewhere ahead said one word that meant now, and the camp cracked open into response. Regnar was already there. He took the boy first, both hands fast, the transfer complete before she'd fully registered him moving. Then her arm. His grip closed around it, steadying rather than pulling, and he looked at her across the few inches between them. She was breathing in short bursts, her side radiating heat she couldn't afford to examine. His eyes held hers for 1 second. Close, clear, the noise of the waking camp pressing in around them. And something passed between them that had no name and needed none. "Move," Lucan said, right behind them. They moved. The withdrawal was fast and imperfect, not panic, not clean. The organized middle of a team that had what it came for and understood that staying had stopped being the mission. Lucan covered the rear. Regnar had the boy. The woman moved with a focused efficiency that asked nothing of anyone. Nara pushed ahead, reading the ground, taking the route back that her body had already memorized. The shadow line, the ridge gap, the tree cover that opened onto the descent. Behind them, Dravon's camp woke fully. Not chaos, response, organized, rapid, 60 trained men acting on information they'd already been given. She heard it and understood its shape before the sound finished reaching her. They'd been expected. Not the rescue, not the route, but the choice. The fact that he would come, that someone would come, that the hostages would be moved for, and that moving for them would cost something in the 3 days left before the blood moon rose. The trap wasn't the tent. The trap was everything that came after. She ran, her side burning, the boy's weight in Regnar's arms ahead of her, the mountain cold and indifferent beneath her feet, and somewhere behind them in the camp they'd left alive and operational and ready, Dravon had already turned to whatever came next. This wasn't finished. Not here. Not tonight. Not before the blood moon. 2 days until the blood moon, and neither of them is in control anymore. Part 3 is coming soon. Subscribe to not miss it.